You're a king, sitting in your high castle atop a kingdom made old and slow by prosperity. Your people have little will to fight, and most of the brave warriors who once conquered your enemies now languish happily and enjoy the spoils of victory. Yet you know that your people still hunger for all the other kingdoms of the land to know you, to fear you, to know who's boss. To prove it, you now wage your wars with the pen and harangue the kings and emperors of faraway lands who you know would never challenge you on your own doorstep. You've really done it this time, with a cutting epithet designed to inspire outrage from a powerful king who lives half a continent away. The scroll your envoy carries sends a message you know will leave your rival seething. You're dumb. But when your rival's response arrives, it doesn't come from a man on a fast horse. It comes from a grand naval armada, one that appeared over the horizon just as it began to lay waste to your grand city. As your palace crumbles, as your people flee for their lives across cobblestone streets, you beg your advisors to explain what went wrong. And they tell you. Your rival, far away though he may be, is very good at this little thing called power projection. And you, my dear king, are not. So in this installment of our Art of War series, we're going to take a closer look at the military strategy of power projection, how nations can extend their military force far beyond their own territory, why they do it, and who, in the 21st century, is doing it as we speak. Now, typically in our Art of War series, we discuss strategies and tactics that just about any military or armed group could figure out if they just put their mind to it. With the right training and the requisite knowledge, any war party can travel through and survive the high mountains or the dense jungles. Any nation with the will to do it can cultivate dangerous pathogens and unleash them on their enemy. Any nation with allies and diplomatic skill can find a partner willing to participate in a proxy conflict, and any nation at war had better figure out how to do military intelligence if it wants to remain a nation at all. Power projection, though, that's a little different. At its core, a strategy of power projection can be simplified to one very basic concept, that a military, and yes, in this case, almost always a proper military, can deploy its forces far outside of its own territory in a way that's sustainable across the long term. A medieval party of Viking raiders pillaging their way through the British Isles all by themselves, that's not power projection. A modern-day group of, let's say, Iranian soldiers loading up into airplanes and conducting a one-time assault on Israel before packing up and returning home, that's not power projection either. In order for power projection to happen, you don't just have to put your forces on or near someone else's territory far away from your own. You've got to be able to keep them supplied, keep them constantly equipped with strategic and tactical directives and intelligence, and use them to assert not just their own will, but the broader will of your nation, even while they're operating far afield. But that list of requirements is a pretty high barrier to entry, and both historically and in the modern day, it's meant that power projection is really difficult to pull off. In order to do it, a nation needs to have ample wealth to be able to fund such an expedition and pay the continual expenses required to maintain it. A nation needs to have an abundance of troops and military equipment, enough that sending a power-projecting force abroad doesn't compromise their ability to defend their own homelands. And they've got to have both the requisite personnel and the requisite expertise to enable a power-projecting mission to survive. That doesn't just mean sending infantry or tanks or air power. It requires devoting experts in logistical supply, experts in gathering intelligence far afield, experts in the language and customs of another land, experts in constructing large-scale field communications, and medical infrastructure to support the people expected to fight. In order to engage in effective power projection, a nation needs to be able to leverage a massive team of experts in their respective fields, both expert warfighters and experts in taking every part of a large-scale military infrastructure and making it happen seamlessly, really far away from home. And just as complex as the question of how power projection works is the question of why. Why would another country go to the trouble of expending so many of its own resources and working so hard for so long that it could project power against a nation or a people that wasn't its neighbor or even anywhere nearby? Generally speaking, there are a few reasons to this. Deterrence, resource acquisition, or direct response to a threat. In the case of deterrence, power projection is a tool used by powerful nations to discourage other powerful nations from beginning to flex their muscles a bit more actively. Take the United States sending warships through the South China Sea in an attempt to demonstrate to the most powerful nation in that area, China, that they've got to account for American military power if they're going to consider expanding into waters near to their territory. In the case of resource acquisition, power projection is a tool to lay claim to certain territories and their known or suspected resources, building a military presence that will cause anybody else with designs on that territory to think twice before deciding to claim it. Take, for example, the efforts of European nations to lay claim to various parts of Africa, Asia, and the New World by sending powerful naval assets and establishing land occupations in areas that they wanted to control. Finally, there's the case of a direct response to a threat. Like we mentioned earlier, power projection is a lot harder than launching raids or one-off attacks, but those smaller military actions are well within the range of nations and non-state actors who can't project power. If they attack a more powerful nation, power projection is often a gateway to either issuing reprisals or eliminating a faraway security threat. Take the American occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, in partial but direct response to a one-off attack on the Twin Towers in New York City. When nations project power abroad, distance and cost almost always go together. The further away you are going to try and project your forces, the harder it's going to be and the more it is going to cost. With that distance, relaying orders gets more and more difficult, especially in historical cases prior to the advent of quick communication technologies like the telegraph and the telephone. Keeping control over forces deployed far from home can be just as difficult and can even present an active danger for weaker regimes who might have reason to fear that a major force sent abroad will start getting ideas about regime change back home. Hard assets can make all of those problems easier to manage. For example, having a grand naval flotilla and an abundance of supply ships to relay materials and messages. In historical cases. In modern cases, it's things like strategic bombers, aircraft carriers, paratroopers, or prefabricated military bases that make the process go more smoothly. But again, that's a question of wealth. In order to make power projection as painless as possible, a nation has to be able to foot the bill, meaning that for nations who can't, even attempting power projection is just not worth the trouble. Now, specific acts of power projection can be categorized in a number of different ways, but in a broad sense, they're best broken up into two key types: hard power and soft power. Generally speaking, soft power is anything that doesn't involve chopping up one's enemies or marching armies into hostile territory. It's establishing military bases on friendly nations' territories or on unclaimed territory to indicate that it's yours, and it's establishing safe, secure sea routes or parking your maritime power in or around an important body of water. It's sending in peacekeeping forces to stabilize a place that might otherwise become hostile to you or become internally violent, and it's responding to crises like famines or natural disasters abroad by using military resources, as if to implicitly show the world that your military forces are capable of establishing a presence there. Hard power, well, that's a bit different. That's the sort of power projection that's all about kicking down doors and deciding what the status quo is going to be. It's hearing a foreign power halfway around the world talk about how much it hates you and parking an army on their doorstep, even if no shots are fired. It's seeing that a country is about to bring, say, a chemical weapons facility online and bombing that facility into destruction before it's even finished. It's seeing an ongoing civil war in another nation between one faction you perceive as friendly and one you perceive as hostile, and sending your own troops in to help bring a favorable end to the fighting. And at times, it's straight up military conquest, deposing an unfriendly regime or taking over a foreign nation for a number of reasons. Of course, delineating soft power versus hard power isn't always an exact science. Together, they form a continuum of escalation, from which a nation that wishes to project power can do it using whichever option they deem most important in the moment. In some cases, a nation might use both soft power and hard power at once, or use soft power with the implicit threat of resorting to hard power. Or they might come in guns blazing with hard power in order to incentivize an unfriendly nation to agree to a longer-term imposition of soft power. Invade and batter a foreign military hard enough, and they might lease your land for a military base in order to stop the violence, and that sort of thing. But it's in the ability to leverage any and all of these options, to be able to choose between them and to use any of them at will, that distinguishes nations who can project their power from those who can't. Early examples of power projection show up on a smaller scale across millennia in the historical records. But if there's one clear name that we've got to start with, it's Alexander the Great of Macedon. Over the course of about 13 years, from 336 to 323 BCE, Alexander III's Macedonian armies embarked on a major campaign of conquest, building a Macedonian empire that far eclipsed most civilizations that had come before. But unlike most ancient wars of territorial expansion, simply swallowing up nearby land, Alexander the Great's wars were an expedition. Riding at the helm of a massive army, Alexander first put down a string of revolts across Macedon's own territorial holdings, and then turned his attention outward. In the north, he crushed resistance in the Balkans to build himself and his empire a bulwark against threats from the north, and then he set out toward the east on a grand campaign. From Anatolia to Asia Minor to Egypt to the heart of Persian territory, and then to Bactria in modern-day Iran, and finally all the way to India, Alexander and his forces marched through fruitless resistance. All the while, Alexander was able to challenge powerful city-states, kingdoms, and even other empires on their own turf, while he himself was hundreds and then thousands of kilometers from home. All the while, his army sustained itself as the final link of a robust logistical backbone, relying largely on Macedon's ability to sustain its troops very far afield. And then, from the example set by Macedon, came the armies of Rome. Over the course of a long line of kings and emperors, the Roman Empire expanded to include the entire Mediterranean and much of continental Europe. But while Rome's ability to project power across the entire Mediterranean rim was impressive on its own, Rome proved itself to have an understanding of force projection that went a lot deeper than just simple bloodshed. Instead, Rome was able to use the threat of force, especially in its early years, rather than actual conquest, in order to compel and coerce a wide variety of local nation-states into compliance. For a very long time, Rome was a pioneer in the use of soft power at a large scale, using a mix of intimidation against enemies and subsidization of reluctant friends in order to demonstrate that it was better to stand beside Rome than to stand up to it. Eventually, Roman leaders began to grow tired of soft power, and they leaned further into the application of hard power, but the empire proved significantly less talented at projecting power that way. Internally, Rome ensured that it could project military force across its own territory and along all of its frontiers, relying on a modern road system, a network of aqueducts, and a substantial military force in order to do so. But while Rome could project hard power at its own fringes, like one famous incident in which Julius Caesar rapidly built a bridge across the Rhine River in order to show Rome's ability to threaten people elsewhere, Roman legions were not equipped to travel far from their own territory. Now, the same can't be said for Rome's ancient rival Carthage on the North African coast. Taking advantage of their location to become an epicenter for trade, the leaders of Carthage also built a powerful navy. They sustained relationships with lesser kingdoms and tribes across North Africa who relied on the Carthaginian navy for protection and their trade ships for prosperity, and who in turn pacified the smaller groups on their own territory. The Carthaginians' network of trading posts quickly grew into cities and then de facto colonies all across the Mediterranean, and while Carthage faced a major barrier to military operations due to a relatively small population from which to raise troops, they got around that issue by projecting power navally instead. The Carthaginian navy was a powerful tool of coercion, through which many wars were avoided, and many of their military sailors worked double duty on trade ships, so that even the appearance of a peaceful Carthaginian merchant vessel all but guaranteed at least some military force on board. Making up for their own manpower problems, Carthage also paid good money to secure the services of a vast mercenary force, many of whom could wage war effectively against the same nations that they'd originally come from. Carthage was able to dominate the seas of the Western Mediterranean for centuries, until the Punic Wars eventually devastated Carthage on its own territory. Of course, the most famous example of Carthaginian force projection, by far, was its ability to send a massive war party through continental Europe, even including war elephants, in order to attack Rome from the north on its own territory. But, as impressive as that was, Carthage's longer-term ability to project power on the seas was far more important. And then we've got to talk about the Mongols, who, both in their time and throughout history, are the picture-perfect example of doing more with less as a military power. Via a military strategy that basically only relied on force projection, the Mongols were able to construct the largest contiguous land empire in all of history. Using light and largely horse-mounted mobile warbands, the Mongols were able to show up on the doorsteps of a wide range of foreign powers, basically all by themselves, and so far from home that the people that they were trying to conquer might not even have maps showing the Mongols' own center of power. Mongol force projection worked because of three key abilities. They could maintain near constant contact across war parties due to their massive numbers of mounted couriers. They could maintain logistical supply of essentials like gear and horses, and they could rely on knowledge and expertise to handle the rest. Mongol war parties were generally capable of creating their own siege equipment, using the resources they found nearby, sustaining themselves off the landscape, and making the sorts of tactical and strategic decisions that would allow for their independent capture of resources in towns, villages, and forts in order to keep going. Mongol imperial law was also designed to keep order in occupied territories without much use of military force, generally emphasizing religious freedom and ensuring that the empire's internal trade structures incentivized all of their captured territories to keep engaging peacefully rather than revolt. During the early 15th century, Ming China would log its own feats of force projection in the form of the Treasure Fleet, a fleet of gargantuan treasure-hunting military ships escorted by vessels more than capable of asserting power on the seas. The fleet traveled across the span of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, reaching as far as the Persian Gulf and East Africa. They logged a number of major naval and land victories, and more importantly, the simple threat of the fleet's military power was enough to make a long list of foreign kings and emperors sign on the dotted line to become vassal states. Through the soft power effects of operating the fleet across the region, the Ming dynasty was able to incorporate its new tributary states into a grand sphere of influence and become the world's leading naval power at that time. The trade routes and networks that the fleet expeditions created would sustain the Ming dynasty for decades. 100 years later, the nations of Western Europe would each take their own crack at power projection in a centuries-long drive for colonization across the known world. Over the span of the colonial era, some nations would be more successful than others, but just about every major nation of that time would establish some sort of territorial holding abroad. Spain would project its power all up and down what's now known as Latin America and the west coast of the United States, overthrowing major native empires in the process. Britain would do the same along parts of the North American east coast and the Caribbean. Portugal would do it in what's now modern-day Brazil, and France would do it across much of modern-day Canada. Across Asia, the same process played out. Britain eventually achieved colonial domination over India while waging a long geopolitical chess match with Russia over much of Central Asia. Portugal, France, Italy, and Belgium would each carve up parts of Africa alongside the British and the Spanish, while the Dutch would take much of modern-day Indonesia and small pockets of South America. In all cases, European maritime power allowed these colonist nations to place major military land forces on territory halfway around the world. Faced with such overwhelming force delivered onto their own doorstep, the peoples in those newly colonized lands largely proved unable to force the colonist nations out. The transatlantic slave trade, the establishment of European-style state structures across the American supercontinent, and the long legacy of colonial exploitation all just followed from there. During both World Wars, power projection strategy was used to varying effects by most of the major participating powers, but it was during these conflicts that one particular nation learned how to make force projection the centerpiece of its military doctrine. And that nation was the United States. Secluded on a separate continent, buffered from the fighting by oceans on either coast, and almost completely devoid of neighbors that stood any chance of threatening the US over land, America would spend 576 days fighting in World War I and nearly 4 years in World War II. For the United States, these years were a study in effective force projection, during which time the US developed capabilities from the use of strategic bombers in Europe to the use of aircraft carriers in the Pacific to the establishment of not only global logistics capabilities, but the capability to defend those logistical supply lines from U-boat and other threats around the world. The war in the Pacific theater was largely a battle between the US and Imperial Japan to assess who was better at force projection, a process that Japan kicked off with its air assault on Pearl Harbor, and one that the United States eventually won after the tide-turning Battle of Midway and a long island-hopping campaign that eventually isolated the Japanese home islands. By the end of World War II, America was ready to spearhead Operation Downfall to take over Imperial Japan itself, meaning that it had become so skilled in power projection that the prospect of deposing an army millions strong on the Japanese home islands and sustaining them across the entire Pacific Ocean seemed perfectly feasible. Then the world settled into the Cold War years, during which time the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union was largely fought through contests in military force projection. On the one hand, both the Americans and the Soviets were compelled to engage in feats of hard power force projection abroad, with the Soviets in Afghanistan and the Americans in Korea and Vietnam, alongside a long list of smaller conflicts. Simultaneously, they were compelled to build up strategic military capabilities, from missile and submarine technology to their nuclear programs and much more, in order to demonstrate a capacity for force projection without actually entering a conflict. On the other hand, the two superpowers were also compelled to use soft power elements of force projection to extend their international spheres of influence, chopping up the world into what eventually became two separate but intertwined attempts at global hegemony. Among the nations allied with each side, Cuba would play an outsized role in Soviet power projection, with over 200,000 Cuban soldiers serving in foreign territories during that time, and with Cuba itself used to project power against the American mainland. Conversely, the US would rely on a number of friendly dictators in Latin America to tamp down on dissidents that might have wrapped up those Latin American nations, but that the United States perceived to fundamentally challenge the American-led status quo on the American supercontinent. Also during the Cold War years, the British would project their own authority over to the Falkland Islands during a 10-week unofficial war with Argentina. But these same years saw Britain, France, and the rest of the European colonial powers lose their capacity for force projection across their former territorial holdings, in part because of those nations' waning capabilities to maintain such a major military effort, and in part because of the establishment of a world order that was far less welcoming of European colonial outreach. The 21st century is replete with individual cases of force projection, although most of the biggest examples have come by way of the US. America's ability to project power into Iraq and Afghanistan was the sole reason why those nations spent much of the 2000s and 2010s embroiled in a war on their own territory. America has long run inventions in Yemen as part of the war on terror, in Somalia as part of the nation's long-running civil war, in Libya as the spearhead of an operation against the forces of Muammar Gaddafi, and in a wide range of global hotspots and flashpoints ever since. But the United States' umbrella of force projection goes far further than its engagement in individual wars. The US has invested incredible amounts of time, money, and manpower into ensuring that it can project force anywhere around the world, and it wants the rest of the world to very much know that. America's fleet of 11 aircraft carriers offers it an incredible ability to park advanced military forces off literally any global coast, while its fleet of strategic and stealth bombers, its many missiles, its new generation ground capabilities, and more are all meant to send a clear message to the rest of the world. Make trouble for America, and America can make much bigger trouble for you. Perhaps more impressive than that is the sheer force and power of American logistics, with enough ships, military cargo planes, and aerial refueling capability to sustain military operations for the long term anywhere. And then there's the United States' use of soft power, its extensive diplomatic and trade agreements around the world, its policy of flying aircraft and sailing military vessels all across the world's designated international territory, and maintaining an extensive network of military bases, even in peacetime, to ensure that American military forces can respond across most of the world at a moment's notice. Of course, any unipolar world isn't likely to last long, and the world's newest major military power, China, is rapidly expanding its abilities to project power abroad. China is among the few world nations to field strategic bombers, to field multiple aircraft carriers, and to employ what's called a blue water navy, one that can operate far into international waters, even if China's blue water capability is still rudimentary at best. China has extended its soft power in a number of ways, building a network of foreign military bases, building trade dependencies, and granting itself leverage over many nations, and engaging in what's called debt trap diplomacy, largely through its Belt and Road Initiative and other infrastructure projects across much of the world. All the while, China has been more and more successful in asserting control across the South China Sea, which may be on China's doorstep, but constitutes a more meaningful act of force projection because of just how strongly the US and its partner nations in East Asia have tried to keep that from happening. As for how well China could actually project hard power in a military encounter, it's harder to say. The Chinese military is fundamentally untested, and it's unclear whether the nation has internalized some hard lessons of force projection that are historically best learned by experience. But at least on paper, they've got the capability nonetheless. And then there's Russia, a nation where force projection capabilities have been something of a mixed bag. To Russia's advantage, it's been able to establish significant force projection capabilities in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Latin America, partly owing to diplomacy and partly owing to the deployment of shadowy paramilitary forces like the Wagner Group. Russia also engaged in multiple military interventions far afield in the last decade, most prominently in Syria and Libya. But Russia's attempts to project major military power against even its own neighbor, Ukraine, have been a lot less successful, and although Russia has gotten a lot better at projecting force into Ukraine since the start of the conflict, its initial failings were exactly the kind that you don't want to have if you're going to claim that you can project military power abroad with any real credibility. Logistical breakdowns, failures in strategic intelligence, and failures to prepare Russian troops for the combat they'd face in Ukraine were all hallmarks of the early phases of Russia's full-scale invasion. With those failings, Russian peacekeeping forces abroad have lost much of their credibility, as evidenced by Azerbaijan's capture of Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023, no longer being deterred by Russian troops in the area. And while American, Russian, and Chinese attempts at power projection are perhaps among the most obvious of the modern era, it's important to note that power projection for less militarily advanced nations is easier than it's ever been. Using 21st century ships and aircraft, 21st century weaponry, and 21st century communications technology, nations have more to gain from projecting power abroad than they've ever had. And in a rapidly shifting world order, where the most powerful countries of the world are trying to establish their precise areas of influence, smaller nations are heavily incentivized to do the same. Just for example, a number of smaller powers maintain aircraft carriers, perhaps the most important emblem of modern force projection capability. That list doesn't just include nations like France or Britain, but Japan, India, Italy, Spain, Thailand, and Turkey, alongside even more who either have the ability to launch aircraft from ships today or would like to be able to do so in the future. For one good example, just check out India, where new military bases and maritime capabilities are popping up all around the Indian Ocean. In recent years, under the leadership of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the country has begun to shift its military posture away from just its standoff with neighboring Pakistan and toward a broader view of its place in South and East Asia and the Indian Ocean. India is engaged in numerous large-scale infrastructure developments abroad, working to establish bases, outposts, and supply depots that seem to be intended to project Indian power across what it considers to be its own sphere of influence. In practice, India's attempts at engaging in military operations abroad have been hit or miss, but recently they've hit more than they've missed, including with a successful maritime deployment to the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea to help rein in the Houthi rebel organization. Not too far away, Iran offers a very different sort of power projection via its so-called axis of resistance across much of Western Asia and the Middle East. We've discussed the axis of resistance at length on this channel, but if you're new here, first, welcome to Warrior Graphics, and secondly, here's the basics. Iran maintains financial, logistical, and military links with a number of foreign nations and non-state actors. Everybody from the Assad regime ruling over Syria, to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, to Hamas in Gaza, to a network of militias in Iraq and Syria. Through that network, Iran projects hard power in the form of military advisors and the supply of Iranian-made warfighting equipment, while its influence over the governments of Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq offers soft power leverage as well. And even beyond those few nations, plenty of other countries around the world are getting better and better at force projection. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are playing an increasingly prominent role in nations like Yemen and even Somalia. Brazil is investing heavily in its capability to project its military power at some point in the future. And South Korea, as we've recently covered on this channel, is orchestrating an informal global network of alliances and trade agreements that allow South Korea's will and its military equipment to exercise a more global reach. Even Ukraine has taken pains to flex its muscles and show that it can project power abroad, sending apparent detachments of special operations troops to Sudan to counteract Russian influence there, although how long Ukraine can sustain that sort of war effort is unclear. In the years to come, it seems that military power projection is increasingly in vogue. As more and more nations build the capability to assert power on each other's doorstep, it's more and more imperative for any nation who doesn't want to be subject to somebody else's power projection to be able to project power themselves. Across the world, a few trend lines seem obvious. The acquisition of more and more aircraft carriers and long-range aircraft by world nations, the frantic reorganization of diplomatic agreements and alliances, and the increased preference of regional powers to engage in military operations on their own terms rather than playing second fiddle to a global power. In the coming decades, new technologies and capabilities will enable new forms of power projection, particularly in the realm of cyber warfare, where a nation need only run cyber operations from the safety of its own territory in order to impose its will abroad. The growing role of mercenary organizations, the introduction of new weapons systems, and the global shift away from placing trust in major powers like the US, Russia, and China will all play a major role of their own. Unlike many of the subjects that we've covered on our Art of War series, power projection isn't a lost art or a waning trend in global defense. It's becoming more important each and every day. And where it leads, well, we're just gonna have to find out together.